Today, we're diving into a really fascinating case from the Philippines, Macariola versus Asuncion. And it all boils down to a simple but incredibly powerful question. When is something that's perfectly legal still completely wrong? It's a story that puts a judge's every move under a microscope, and it really tests our ideas about ethics and public trust. So let's get right to it. The big question here is, can a judge go out and buy a piece of property that was at the center of a case he just finished deciding? Now, you'd think the answer would be a simple yes or no, but it's not. It pulls us right into this fascinating gray area where what the law strictly says and what's actually right, well, they might be two very different things. So let's meet the people involved. On one side, you have the complainant, Bernadita R. Macariola, and the person she's accusing. That would be the Honorable Elias B. Asuncion, who at the time was a judge for the Court of First Instance of Leyte. And listen, these were not minor complaints. Macariola laid out 4 really serious charges against Judge Asuncion. First, and this is the big one, that he illegally bought property connected to a case he presided over. Second, that he broke anti-graft laws by getting involved in a private business. And the last 2 were about hanging around with the wrong crowd and just a general lack of ethical behavior. With accusations this serious, the Supreme Court really had no choice but to launch a full-blown investigation. Okay, so to really get what's going on with that first charge, we have to rewind a little bit. It all started with a family inheritance case, civil case number 3010. This was basically a dispute where a family needed the court to help them divide up property left by their father. And the judge who made the final call on who gets what? You guessed it, Judge Asuncion. Now, the whole controversy really zeroes in on this one specific piece of land, Lot 1184E. This was just one of several lots that got divided up among the family members based on Judge Asuncion's decision. You're going to want to remember that lot number. It is the key piece of evidence in this whole affair. The timeline here is just fascinating, and you have to pay close attention to the dates. Check this out. The judge makes his final decision in June 1963. Then silence for more than a year. In July 1964, the family sells the lot to somebody else entirely, a Dr. Gallopon. It's only after another 8 months, in March 1965, that Dr. Gallopon turns around and sells a piece of that lot to Judge Asuncion. This chain of events, and all that time in between, is absolutely critical to how the Supreme Court is going to see things. Okay, so with all that laid out, the Supreme Court had to tackle the main question. Was the judge's purchase actually illegal? And their analysis, you'll see, got really technical really fast. Here's where it gets down to the nitty-gritty. The law, specifically Article 1491 of the Civil Code, is super clear. It says judges are forbidden from buying property that is part of a case that is still happening in their court. The key phrase there is in litigation. But Judge Asuncion bought the lot long after his decision was final and couldn't be appealed anymore. So from a purely technical reading of the law, that property was no longer in litigation. And that was the whole ballgame, right there. Based on a strict, by-the-book reading of the law, the Supreme Court found that Judge Asuncion was technically in the clear. He hadn't violated the civil code because the case was over and done with. He bought it from a third person almost 2 years after he made his ruling. Legally speaking, he was off the hook for the most serious charge. But hold on, we're not done yet. Remember that second charge? That one accused the judge of illegally getting involved in private business, specifically as an officer in a company called the Traders Manufacturing and Fishing Industries. So the court just went down the list. First, they looked at this old code of commerce. They basically said, nope, that's a relic from the Spanish era. It's not in effect anymore. Okay, next, the Anti-Graft Act. The court found that this law only kicks in if a judge uses their official position to get a business advantage, and there was no evidence of that happening here. And finally, the civil service rules. The court clarified that judges aren't regular civil servants. They operate under a whole different set of rules from the Judiciary Act. So one by one, that second charge just completely fell apart. So you might be thinking, okay, he didn't technically break any laws. Case closed, right? Well, not so fast. This is where the story pivots. We're moving away from the black and white letter of the law and into the very gray but very important territory of judicial ethics. And a key word we really need to understand here is impropriety. This isn't about whether something is illegal. It's about actions that are just improper. They don't meet the incredibly high standards of honesty and decency that we expect from someone in a judge's position. And this, right here, is the standard the Supreme Court held him to. It's Canon 3 of the Canons of Judicial Ethics.
And it's tough. It's not just about being proper. It's about avoiding even the appearance of being improper. A judge's life, as the canon says, has to be beyond reproach.
So when the court looked at his actions through this lens, what did they see? They concluded that while what Judge Asuncion did wasn't illegal, it was, and these are their exact words, unwise and indiscreet. He should have known better. He had to understand how this was going to look to the public.
And this just begs the question, doesn't it? If he didn't actually break the law, why does the perception, the mere appearance of it, carry so much weight? Why is it such a big deal?
The answer really gets to the absolute foundation of our justice system. It's all about public trust. For the courts to work, we, the people, have to have complete faith in the honesty and fairness of our judges. So any action that creates doubt or suspicion or mistrust, even if it's perfectly legal, it chips away at that faith. It damages the entire institution.
So, the Supreme Court has found no technical violation of the law, but a very clear ethical lapse. How did they decide to wrap this all up? What was the final judgment?
First, the court quickly dealt with those other lingering charges. The accusation about the impostor and the general defiance of law, they found there was no merit to them at all. The judge was completely cleared on those points. And that allowed the court to focus its final judgment entirely on that core ethical issue. And so here we are at the final formal words from the Supreme Court. After this long, exhaustive investigation, what was the consequence for Judge Asuncion's unwise and indiscreet behavior? The verdict was he was reminded. That's it. Not fined, not suspended, not fired. The court simply reminded him to be more discreet. Now, that might sound like a tiny slap on the wrist, but in the very formal world of the judiciary, a public reminder from the Supreme Court is a serious, serious rebuke. It's a formal warning shot, telling the world, you may not have broken the law, but you absolutely failed to meet the higher standard your office demands. And that leaves us right back where we started, with that profound question at the heart of this case. If an action doesn't break a specific law, can it still be fundamentally wrong? The case of Judge Asuncion suggests that for those we trust with power, the answer is a resounding yes. It teaches us that in public service, just following the law is the floor, not the ceiling. The true measure is holding yourself to a standard of conduct that is forever beyond reproach.